lot of time here. I'm Steve McDonald. I direct the Africa programs and the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity here at the Center. I've had another hat in my past, which I'll mention in a minute, that pertains to what we're talking about today. But first of all, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's obviously probably known to you all as the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, and established in '68 by Congress. And mainly we're focused on doing research and scholarship and policy outreach on issues because of Woodrow Wilson's belief in the need to bring together the world of ideas and the world of policy. And a serious part of that is the deep research we do into the Cold War era, of which today's conversation is a part. We have a couple of speakers with us who I'll introduce in a moment. I think it's always a good idea, if everybody will agree, that we all know who each other are and who's around the table, who we're talking to. So let's do a quick introduction of 2 lines about yourself and your names, going right from there.
Carl Ashley, I work at the Office of the Historian at the Department of State.
Carl, welcome.
I'm Dave Nichols. I also work at the Office of the Historian.
Oh.
The whole table works at the Office of the Historian.
Same office, okay. You can just say ditto. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
No exaggeration, right? Oh, yeah.
Welcome.
Whose watch I have. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh. Ah.
I'm Jim Dan, Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training and Foreign Service Institute.
Ah, Jim. Okay.
Josh Fox,
Ah, and on the back row, anybody who? Welcome. Okay, did I miss anyone? Well, Myra, I don't know who's watching the shop, but
Nobody. But our boss is here, so it's okay.
Okay. Well, I'm going to, because you don't have bios in front of you except for the brief thing that went out, the other hat that I once wore, which makes this an interesting afternoon for me, is that I'm a former Foreign Service officer who was the desk officer, and I think it's probably a historic position, the last desk officer for the Portuguese African territories from April of 1973 to November of 1975. After which time, as you all know, the desks were divided up between AFW and AFC and AFS, I'm sorry. And then I went to Pretoria as a political officer in the embassy there. Now I had my own beat in South Africa as a political officer, but I also, because since the unilateral declaration of independence in Rhodesia, when we didn't have any representation up in Rhodesia, I was the officer who covered Rhodesian affairs. So I was very much involved in the first rounds of what was then called the Anglo-American proposals, which became, of course, Lancaster House in their extension, and was there when Henry Kissinger came down for the first famous visit and the meeting at the rugby match in Pretoria with Ian Smith and B.J. Forster and et cetera. So I was also up in Harare, its former incarnation, a great deal with our Zambian ambassador, who was conducting the on-the-ground negotiations with Joshua Nkomo and Debini Sitola and a number of people. So the first thing I did when I saw the draft of the volume that we're working on today was look in the index for my name, and it wasn't there. So I have to do Freedom of Information Act because an awful lot of those things were preliminarily drafted by me. So I will, probably more so than a normal moderator, probably get involved a little bit in the substance of today's discussion. But I'm going to turn it over to begin with, to Anna Mart van Veck, who is here as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, but is a senior lecturer in international studies at Monash University in South Africa, where she specializes in the history of South Africa's nuclear program. Which is not irrelevant to this period at all. And since earning her PhD in 2005, she's published prolifically on this subject, including peer-edited journals in Cold War History, Historia, South African History Journal, and History Compass. She's an expert in this field and has a background in oral and critical oral history research. And then Myra, I probably don't need to introduce because I guess you all know
everybody.
Yeah, so, with that said, I think I'll turn it over to Anna Mart. It was a fascinating period. Obviously, '69 is a little bit before my becoming involved in it. I recall distinctly when I came back from a posting in Uganda to be assigned to the desk on the Portuguese African territories in April of '73 after we closed our post in Uganda. I thought I'd really sort of hit the backwater. I mean, the most exciting thing that came across my desk in the beginning was an annual report I had to do for Charlie Diggs over in the Africa Subcommittee. A weekly report, I'm sorry, I said an annual report, a weekly report that we had to do, and there wasn't really much to put into it because, of course, the tenor of the times was the Portugal, NATO politics, the use of the Azores base, particularly after the '73 Yom Kippur War, kind of dictated what we were doing towards the Portuguese territories. After the Wiriyamu massacre in July of '73 in Mozambique, things began to change, and we all know how the history unfolded. And so it got to be far from a backwater, where I ended up sitting alongside my series of assistant secretaries of state, one after the other as they got fired by Kissinger because they weren't quite doing what he wanted to do, and he dominated and was overbearing on the Africa Bureau. So I came in with David Newsom and Don Esom and then Shoffley and then Ed Mulcahy. I may have set a record in a very short amount of time for the numbers of assistant secretaries I worked for. But with that said, Anna Mart, I'm sorry. It's easy to say, I don't know why.
That's fine. No, thank you very much to Steve and Tim also for the opportunity for me to talk to you a little bit about South Africa and its turbulent history. Not only South Africa, but Southern Africa as a whole. I'm a native South African. I speak Afrikaans, that's my home language. In the period that this volume was published, 1969 to 1976, I was still very small. So I can't remember any of the turbulent things that happened in the region during that era. But I am in the privileged position of being in contact with the majority of the apartheid leaders of the time who are still alive. People with the likes of former foreign President Pik Botha, as well as F.W. de Klerk, who was obviously at the end of the 1980s. I've been having a series of interviews with the likes of these people, and it makes it easier because I can speak Afrikaans. And also because all of you are historians, obviously, or work in the office of the historian. The other thing that I want to reiterate is, the access to the archives in South Africa that is becoming more and more open. So if any of you are interested in traveling to South Africa and seeing what we have, there's some wonderful documents there. And especially in our Foreign Affairs archives, you don't need to speak Afrikaans to be able to see the documents there. Let me start off by saying that this volume, wow, it's an amazing piece of work, and it's of immense value for any scholar of the turbulent history of Southern Africa. It's been a volume that has long been anticipated by myself and other colleagues that are not in the U.S., that would like to, that are working on U.S. foreign relations. It certainly provides a bird's-eye view of the U.S. thinking and planning at the time, which is unparalleled by any of the other role players in Southern Africa. History still awaits the day that a comprehensive volume of this magnitude will be published by any of the countries that were involved in that turbulent period in history. Now, what I thought to do first is just to refresh the memory a little bit and to orientate those who are not so familiar with the history of Southern Africa is to just provide a very brief overview of the political and the geostrategic factors that shaped the Southern African region after the Second World War. Now, at the end of the Second World War, we find that Southern Africa was still firmly under the control of various colonial masters. 1910, South Africa was the exception. We were the Union of South Africa after 1910, but still very much under the influence of the British. Modern-day Botswana and Lesotho, and I've got a little map there so that you can orientate yourself as to where these countries are. So modern-day Botswana and Lesotho, Swaziland, Malawi, and Zambia were all British colonies after the Second World War. And Britain also had formal control over Rhodesia's constitutional development and external affairs. Angola and Mozambique, in turn, were Portuguese colonies. And today's Namibia, which was then known as Southwest Africa, and formerly was a German colony, was given as a mandate to South Africa after the First World War. And South Africa very much regarded Southwest Africa as the fifth province of South Africa, and as such it was also then incorporated into the Union of South Africa in 1950. Okay, now South Africa was by far the strongest country in the region by virtue of its size, its population, and also its economic hegemony. Now, despite the election of an Afrikaner nationalist government that was committed to the racial segregation policy of apartheid in 1948, it managed to maintain its position in the West as a potential ally and a reliable business partner. Now, I'm talking still post-Second World War. Now, throughout the 1950s, the apartheid government was still perceived as a respected member of the international community and the Commonwealth. And most of all, it retained a measure of strategic importance to the West, especially in view of the Cold War that was heating up, which still haven't reached Southern Africa, but was heating up in the rest of the world. So the apartheid government was fiercely anti-communist, and they even participated in the Berlin airlift and the Korean War. Now, for this reason, in the 1950s, we find that the Western governments were reluctant to join in the condemnation of Pretoria when it refined and strengthened its instruments of segregated social control. And this was done through a spate of repressive legislation, which included the suppression of the Communism Act in 1950. In the 1960s, we see that the tide was starting to turn in Southern Africa as a whole. Of course, in the 1960s was the era of the newly independent African states. One African state after the other became independent, except in Southern Africa. Now, all of these states joined the United Nations, and there they started to target the repressive government in South Africa with an avalanche of resolutions against apartheid and Pretoria's treatment of its black majority, and also its refusal to grant independence to Southwest Africa. The momentum for this was really triggered in March 1960. You probably all heard of, the majority of you heard of the Sharpeville massacre of March 1960, in which the South African police opened fire on a group of peaceful protesters. And this was followed also by the banning of the African National Congress and some of the other black-dominated parties in Southern Africa. One of the early victories of these newly independent African states in the UN came in 1963, when they reached a compromise with the Kennedy administration to support a voluntary UN arms embargo against South Africa. I might add, a very reluctant Kennedy administration. Now, at the same time, looking at Rhodesia, the Wilson government in Britain also came under fire for its failure to deal effectively with the crisis in Rhodesia that followed Ian Smith's unilateral declaration of independence in 1965, while at the same time Zambia and Malawi was granted independence by Britain. So there's a bit of a cliche there. Portugal still clung to Angola and Mozambique, and South Africa to Southwest Africa. Okay, we were not prepared to grant independence to Southwest Africa. So we see that at the end of the 1960s, there were sporadic guerrilla wars that started to break out all over Southern Africa, specifically in Southwest Africa, Angola, and Mozambique. And it's only at this point, in the late 1960s, that we see the Soviet Union starting to get involved in Southern Africa. They had largely been on the periphery, but now they went into solidarity with the Third World, calling themselves anti-colonial, and thus in support of the Third World's struggle against colonization. The Soviet policy at this stage in Southern Africa was little more than rhetoric. There wasn't real practical things that they did. In the absence of economic leverage, the inability to project influence at long range, and the military and the economic weaknesses of its allies in the Organization of African Union, that meant that they had little achievement in Southern Africa. And of course, in the view of the United States, the Soviet Union was trying to exert its influence in Southern Africa, and hence it had to be stopped. Okay, and this now then brings us to 1969 and the inauguration of the Nixon administration, also then where this volume takes off. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the volume, while at the same time also giving you a little bit of history, okay, of Southern Africa at the same time, how everything fits into the puzzle. The Nixon administration ushered in an effort to change both the style and the substance of U.S. foreign relations. At this point, we see that anxiety that the African continent was threatened by a communist offensive had receded even before Nixon came to power, which was largely due to the Soviet inability to achieve something concrete. Kissinger's objective as national security advisor still seemed to be the management of the U.S. relationship with the Soviet Union within the framework of the Cold War. And for this, they needed reliable local allies worldwide. Apartheid governments in South Africa, their opinion was if they could be stabilized, they could be just such a local reliable partner in the Southern African region. As a result of this new foreign policy review, 85 national security memorandums were ordered by Kissinger. Two of those, numbers 47 and 89, dealt with Southwest Africa and Rhodesia respectively, and both can be found in the volume. And one of those, number 39, which is document 6 in the volume, directed a comprehensive review of U.S. policy towards Southern Africa, south of Congo and Tanzania. Now, the study that was done in response to NSSM 39, which is document 17, listed 6 different policy options for Southern Africa. Ultimately, Kissinger narrowed the options to 3. So the 6 went to 3. I see there's some people nodding, so you're aware of this. And the 3 options were the following. The first was to release the restrictions on the white states and to avoid any involvement at all in the black-white rivalries in Southern Africa. Second option was some limited association with both sides. And thirdly, disengagement from the white states and a move towards the blacks. Ultimately, option 2 was chosen in view of the mentioned desire to find reliable local allies worldwide. Kissinger at the time made the following statement: the whites are here to stay. Okay? And he basically said the only way that change is going to come in Southern Africa is through them. So we need to engage them. He also said that the blacks are not going to achieve what they want to achieve through violence. So we need the whites to find a balance in Southern Africa. So the Nixon administration would, from this point onwards, then seek to secure continued contact and dialogue with Pretoria. Indeed, it accepted South Africa as a state with a positive and dynamic regional role, whose cooperation was needed in achieving a negotiated settlement of the Rhodesian issue. And this, of course, led to détente between South Africa and the frontline states, which was enhanced by Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy. Now, it would appear from the documents in the volume over the next few years, reports on the best way forward in Southwest Africa and the issue of the settlement in Rhodesia would dominate the Southern African policy initiatives of the State Department. And this was punctuated, and this is very interesting. I always enjoy reading the transcripts of what Kissinger actually said. But the same was also true for Nixon, and my eyebrows, went up quite a few times about some blistering comments that they made towards the blacks in Africa. It was a kind of like a blistering arrogance towards the black African states. And there's an example, Nixon's comments on page 53. It's a good example of that. along with a seemingly fundamental failure to understand the animus of African nationalism at the state level. And this points to the fact that the US policy towards diverse African nationalist movements, which we call the liberation movements, had evolved in an ad hoc way and lacked coherence. Indeed, it was noted in a survey in mid-1971, which is also in the volume, that the State Department had not conducted a detailed review analysis since the early 1960s. Okay, now on Rhodesia, the real expert on Rhodesia is really Dr. Sue Onslow, who is at the London School of Economics. So she gave me a few comments that, I'm going to give you in courtesy to her. She said, while the British side of the Anglo-US relations on the Rhodesia question is relatively well known, this volume sheds welcome light on US policymaking towards this intractable problem, which did so much to compromise Britain's great power pretensions and hopes. Indeed, as Henry Kissinger remarks in the volume, the Rhodesia issue was the only one in which the world supported the maintenance of colonialism. And that can be found on page 100. Secondly, the documents are very useful on the policy debates and the personal views on the issue of Chrome. And one of the US scholars that wrote on Rhodesia and Chrome, of course, is Andy DeRoche. Okay, now the political nuance and the sensitivity are shown at the lower official level compared to Nixon's sympathies with the Byrd Amendment of the time. In particular, the dynamic between Nixon and Kissinger on the issue of Rhodesian chrome exports and the Byrd Amendment is very revealing of the tensions within the Nixon administration at the time. Thirdly, there's little reference to the fact that Kissinger's Year of Africa of 1976 and the Kissinger initiative to resolve the Rhodesian issue was indeed an Anglo-American policy. So it's one of the gaps that Sue just identified in the volume. And she illuminated this in a forthcoming article that's going to be published in Diplomatic History soon, which is called We Must Gain Time, and Dr. Kissinger, I presume. Okay, so that's a forthcoming article, as I said. And for this, she has drawn extensively on the Gerald Ford papers, which is illuminated in the preface of the volume as being very valuable indeed. Now, on a wider basis, the documents show lack of awareness of the extent to which Portugal, South Africa, and Rhodesia constitutes a bloc by 1971, okay, being the three white minority governments in Southern Africa. They kind of like, despite ideological differences and other differences, they started to form a bloc by 1971. And there we see that current works by upcoming historian Jamie Miller. He's a PhD candidate at Cambridge University. And also Robert McNamara, who's also in the UK, shows the emergence of economic and political, military, financial collaboration, despite sharp ideological differences. Also, there's a marked contrast in Nixon's refusal to acknowledge that the black American vote had any relevance to the Rhodesian question, to Ford and Kissinger's attempt to use the Rhodesian issue, and hence the race card in the 1976 presidential campaign. Right, if we go back to 1972, that's now a personal comment that I've got. Looking at the lack of the documents in the volume between 1972 and 1974, it would appear that the State Department was content with the status quo in terms of their policy vis-à-vis Southern Africa. And they largely shunted South Africa's efforts to try and capitalize on its strategic position by projecting itself as the bastion of the free world. Indeed, they seem to feel that in the improbable event of a shootout with the Soviet Union in the Southern Oceans, South Africa's fierce anti-communist posture would leave it no choice but to open up their facilities to the West. So, they largely shunted the apartheid government, while at the same time using them in efforts to get to a settlement in Rhodesia. So the West we see at this point at the best of both worlds, a near certain guarantee of South Africa's support in a crisis, without the expensive political price tag that accompanied closer political and military cooperation. So even though there are few documents on this in the volume, this fact is actually illuminated. Another comment that I have is that this failure to impress the West led to a slight shift in Pretoria's position. And now they started to argue that the country's value as a supplier of key raw materials entitled it to explicit Western acknowledgement of its role in the anti-communist struggle. Unfortunately, on this specific issue, I do not see any reaction from the State Department to this. So it may be that the State Department didn't comment on that particular issue, but yeah, there's some lack of documents there. Another important shift at this time entailed South Africa's nuclear development. By 1970, it had discovered how to enrich uranium. It developed its own unique process to do so. And by 1971, they requested low-enriched uranium and tenders for 2 nuclear power generating reactors from the United States. Now, the volume does include some documents referring to this and also of the support of the State Department for South Africa's requests, mainly because of the historic mutually beneficial cooperation between the two countries in the nuclear energy field. At the same time, the State Department also, and this is evident from the documents, there are some concerns for US domestic and international criticism because of the possible military application of the technology and materials, and of course South Africa's continued refusal to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, what is lacking in the volume is any reference to the State Department's reaction to Pretoria's announcement in May 1974, after a successful projectile test with non-nuclear material, that they now had the capability to build a nuclear bomb. It was interesting, that there was no comment that I could find in the volume on that specific aspect. Okay, fast forward to 1975, and the Cold War is about to arrive in Southern Africa. 1975, we see the abortive South African military intervention in Angola. Why did they intervene? Here it is very important that you understand the perceptions and the thinking of Pretoria at the time. They were petrified by what they perceived as an imminent communist takeover in Southern Africa, and determined that any further expansion had to be blocked at all costs. For them, it was really the red danger that was at the, on the verge of enveloping South Africa. Of course, it would also be a danger to their position of power, in Southern Africa. So in the words of apartheid Foreign Minister Pik Botha, quote, "My impression was, and still is, that Cuban troops came into Angola, and they were prodding a southward thrust towards the Namibian border, and we genuinely believed that the Soviet Union was mainly behind this. It was perceived to be a Soviet intrusion, as they have done in Afghanistan, and they've done in other parts of the world," close quote. At the same time, we also see Soviet-Cuban intervention in Angola, which was created by the Portuguese withdrawal and the outbreak of a civil war between the rival liberation movements in Angola. Now, 2 things in the volume are of particular interest to me. The documents pertaining to the 40 Committee. I will go back to that in a while. Of course, the 40 Committee, for those who don't know, it was a division of the executive branch of the United States government whose mandate was to review proposed major covert actions in other countries. Now, a very important meeting, the second thing that's of particular interest is a very important meeting between Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda and his Foreign Secretary with Gerald Ford and Kissinger in April 1975. The document implies a degree of collaboration between Zambia and South Africa on the UNITA issue, UNITA being one of the liberation movements in Angola, and Zambia as a representative of the Organization of African Union. It also shows the emergence of Kissinger's thinking on the interconnectedness of Southern Africa, that you cannot divide the various processes or various things that was happening in Southern Africa. You couldn't look at it in isolation. They were all interconnected, and also then identify the key players. Back to the documents of the 40 Committee, it provides a valuable overview of the covert actions of the United States in Angola. The documents highlight what is largely already known, that Kissinger was determined to secure a Cold War victory in Angola, and the misrepresentation of Soviet involvement with the MPLA in 1975. Here I want to refer to a conference, an oral history conference that Sue Onslow and I hosted in South Africa in 2009, where we had role players from both sides of the Southern African struggles at the conference around the table. So that included foreign apartheid leaders like Pik Botha, but then also highly placed officials from the former Soviet Union, from SWAPO, from UNITA, from the Cubans, you know. So it's due to be published soon by the Wilson Center, around about towards the end of the year, beginning of next year. And there, when I'm talking about the misrepresentation of Soviet involvement with the MPLA, that came out very strongly at that conference, that the United States had a perception of just how involved the Soviet Union was in Southern Africa that wasn't really the case. For example, the Soviets only had advisors in Angola. They didn't have troops in Angola. They also didn't really provide, you know, all the equipment that was needed for the war in Angola. So if anybody is interested, the transcripts of the conference are available online. So if you drop me an email, I can give you the link. If you're interested to see just how involved or not involved was the Soviet Union in Angola in 1975. This brings us back to South Africa's involvement and the decision to go into Angola. And just it raises a point of Kissinger and the CIA's encouragement for South Africa to indeed go into Angola with our military, not our military, but I'm South African, so let's say our military at the time. So possibly also then with Kenneth Kaunda as the link person between the CIA and South Africa. Okay, I'm on my last page. In a discussion I had with Pik Botha, he insisted that former Prime Minister John Foster had said that he was assured at the highest level on the American side that they will support us and that they would wish us to do it. In other words, take the South African military into Angola. And this is where the 40 committee documents became really important. It is very clear, the volume highlights that there was clandestine US collaboration with South Africa in the Angolan war, if not in terms of military hardware or other equipment, then at least in terms of encouragement. There's two specific comments that I want to highlight here. The one of Scowcroft on page 348. We do not want to discourage them. It's in the 40 committee meeting. And Potts on page 342. We want to try to keep the South Africans in the game. Of course, in 1976, the US Congress pulled the plug on US involvement in Angola. I must add that the US covert operations were not only in support of South Africa, but also in support of the other, non-communist parties fighting in Angola, including UNITA. So in 1976, the US Congress pulled the plug on US involvement in Angola, and it was a vote that was termed by Ford as mildly deplorable on page 412. And that led to an end to the covert CIA support to the South African military forces. Pretoria withdrew from Angola, saying that they were not prepared to fight the West's battle against communism on their own. Right, now with a few closing remarks, as I said before, the volume has long been eagerly anticipated by scholars of Southern African history, and it was definitely worth the wait. I want to add there that for a definitive view of the powers and the perceptions at play during this period in Southern Africa, it is of utmost importance to study this volume alongside the records of the countries involved in the various struggles and peace processes in Southern Africa. This is a painstaking process at best, given the geographical location of the countries and also the access to the archives in many of those countries. But a number of scholars are making quite remarkable inroads into uncovering the hidden record in those countries. A few examples is Piero Gleises, who has unprecedented access to the Cuban records. Sue Onslow, who's got an oral history project going on Rhodesia. There's Chris Saunders, South African. He's working on Namibia and Angola. Vladimir Shubin, Russian. He's working on the view from the Soviet side. it's remarkable the amounts of documents that he is able to come up from the Russian archives or the former Soviet archives. Andy de Roche, who's working on Zambia. There's others like Ryan Irwin at Yale, looking, and then my own research, of course, which focuses on South Africa's nuclear development amidst these peace negotiations and the armed combat that was prevalent in Southern Africa at the time. And then there's also the upcoming publication of the oral history conference volume. Thank you.
Thank you. What a review.
Well, Anna Mart, you covered my volume so well, I'm not even going to say anything else. No. Actually, I'm very lucky to have the editor, our former general editor here, who helped me with this volume quite a bit. And Bill McAllister had asked me to talk a bit about the development of the volume, how I researched it, what my selection process and that sort of thing were on this. And I think it was very instructive for me to get some of this information back from you. Thank you very much. I started the office in 2001 and was handed this assignment and told, you know, make up a research plan and get to it. He's kind of getting dropped in the deep end with no water wings. But it actually turned out fairly well because instead of someone directing me, I was able to go into the collections and let the documents take me where they would. And I ended up going in some very interesting places as a result. Those of you who are familiar with FRUS know that we have certain bread and butter files that we always look at, the NISMs and NISDMs that have been referred to here, a lot of the studies. And they took me in directions that I wasn't originally thinking I would go. One of those directions actually took me back to the Central Foreign Policy files and some odd things that came out. And I guess with Nixon, perhaps it wasn't so odd. But this in particular stood out. There are a few outlier kinds of issues in this volume. One of them involves Arthur Ashe. And the thing that stuck out in my mind when I started researching is this: why does Richard Nixon care whether or not Arthur Ashe gets a visa to South Africa? I mean, I don't think he has a lot of black friends, and so why is he so seized by this issue? And it actually gets to an NSC meeting where he's asking, what's the status of this? So I just thought it was kind of weird and interesting, and so I included it. But the things that come out in the Central Foreign Policy files are basically what you were pointing to. Policy in Southern Africa is driven by the State Department almost entirely, even more so, of course, when Kissinger gets in as Secretary of State. And early on, even though you have these new studies saying this is the policy, and you would think that maybe Washington is going to be a little more involved, they really aren't, because the policies don't change that much. They're just interested in maintaining a balance so that you don't lose touch with the white minority regimes that are in power in the region and presumably will be able to keep communists out of the region, but also, I don't want to say paying lip service, but acknowledging that you do have these guerrilla or liberation movements underway, although no one believed they would be able to do anything. They figured they'll never win. They were wrong. Some of the other files that I found really, really interesting, of course, with Angola, are the intelligence files. And they created some unique challenges for us. I think that Ted and I worked that fairly well and were able to get out some very good documents, particularly the 40 committee documents. And I'll talk about that in a bit when I talk about my selection process. Well, I might as well talk about that now. So early on, really up until about 1974, as I said, State Department looms large in all of this. And so basically the documents reflect how state is trying to address some particular issues in South Africa. Primarily issues like apartheid, where they're trying to not chastise the South Africans, but deal with some of the more, how do I put this? The appearance of our involvement with South Africans was becoming a real irritant here in the United States, and that irritant was embodied by Charlie Diggs, who was making a royal pain of himself as far as the Department of State was concerned, and demanding that we withdraw all of our diplomatic ties, and of course that was not going to happen. So it's almost a dance where we're sort of making little concessions but not actually backing away from the region. So there's the whole issue of not sending a representative to the Opera House when it opens, and there's a lot of back and forth about that. There's back and forth about actually assigning a black foreign service officer to Pretoria, and the ambassador flat out didn't want it and asked them to be recalled, but they went ahead and did it anyway. And one of the areas that I found interesting, because it comes up again and again and again, the State Department trying to develop policies for American businesses in South Africa where they could continue to do business there, not run afoul of the South African government, but also sort of soften some of the restrictions there. So things like desegregating lunchrooms. I mean, the sorts of things that were going on as a result of the civil rights movement here, they were trying to duplicate with American companies working in South Africa. They thought they wouldn't run afoul, but alas, they did. But this movement will continue, and in the next Carter volume, you'll see that it gets incorporated in the Sullivan Principles, and the Europeans, the EC9, develop a code of conduct, and so it sort of goes from there. Now, as far as the selection process, I ran into a lot of problems because it's a lot of countries, a lot of issues, and a lot of years. Something has to give, because Ted was a taskmaster. He would not let you go over that page limit, and he just yank, yank, yank. So I sort of stuck with the things. I think the vast majority of the documentation are on the big ticket items like Angola and Rhodesia. But Rhodesia actually begins, of course, as part of the Portuguese Africa compilation. And as we were talking about earlier, the concern of the Kissinger administration that Portugal not deny access to the Azores base that we needed during that time period. And so once again, we relegate to someone else to deal with these issues. We ask them to help. We ask them to, why don't you work to try to get these groups, give them some concessions and that kind of thing, but it doesn't actually happen. And eventually, well, in 1974, Portugal washes its hands and feet of its African colonies, and the trouble begins, at least as far as we're concerned. And that led to this long series of meetings that really, if you get the chance, you have to read these 40 committee meetings. They're just astounding. And one of the things that I found really useful here is by focusing on high policy level meetings, I had fewer declassification issues. I mean, everybody knows what happened in Angola. It's like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. People show up and they can recite the dialogue word for word. Everybody knows what happened. So what was I going to be able to do that would add anything to this? And I figured, well, we'll look a little bit more at the policy development. And when you read some of these documents, some of this is appalling. You were talking about the disdain for Africans. And I think Clements at one point said, they're very eager to fight. They eat each other. And I was sitting there, oh, my God. So that sort of thing was challenging in that there are a few documents that were very, very difficult to declassify. But by and large, I was able to get almost everything in there. With regard to Rhodesia, it's almost as if you can see Kissinger deflating over the course of this volume. Originally, he just didn't care. He's like, yeah, I've got bigger fish to fry. But when he actually gets involved in the region, I don't know if he thinks by sheer force of will he'll be able to force these changes, but they just don't happen, and certainly not in the way that he had hoped. Originally, they're just throwing some money at this, and then they're realizing, well, I guess we'll actually have to do a little more than that. And so rather than introduce Americans into all of this, he looks for partners in the region, South Africa, Zaire, our boy Mobutu, who really knew how to play the communist card quite well and was able to get a tremendous amount of support. Also, Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia was used to go into the region. And it's interesting how they keep referring to this as getting him a little pregnant. I don't know how you can be a little pregnant, but anyway, so involving all these other people in the region, and I think the volume documents that quite well. But at the same time, he is not able to stem the tide, and the MPLA and, of course, Congress will thwart him more than anyone else by cutting off funding. And even when they realize we're out of here, we can't do anything, they keep trying. All up until about April of '76, they're out trolling for dollars and trying to get people to continue the fight. And at this period, George Bush joined Central Intelligence Service, and I remember this 40 committee meeting where they're all sitting around the table, and somebody asked, well, what is it that we're trying to do here? And George Bush says, well, we're trying not to get clobbered. And then this is the goal at this point. They just don't even care. Then we go to people who had originally been supporting our efforts there, who are now saying, well, the MPLA has won, and we're going to recognize this government. And Kissinger's saying, please don't, and they do. So I think the man is visibly under a lot of strain by 1976, and that brings us to Rhodesia. I think that in a certain way, he saw this from two different perspectives. Number one, he figured, well, the Cubans have basically turned the tide in Angola. Castro keeps talking about Cuban adventurism, and perhaps Rhodesia's next. And so South Africa was concerned about this. We were very concerned about it. And he figured the best thing we can do is end this conflict through a negotiated settlement. But he also understood that he couldn't possibly do this on his own, and he needed South Africa desperately to bring Ian Smith to the table. He also had to work through the British, so he's using the British to talk to the frontline presidents. They're talking to the guerrilla movements in Rhodesia. It's just amazing how they thought all this would come together. And ultimately, everyone did come to the table, and nothing was resolved. And you can hear the frustration in his voice. He basically blames the British for messing all of this up. It was badly handled. What were they thinking? And I think some of the more poignant things that I got out of it was his lack of understanding of what was really going on in Southern Africa. I don't think he ever quite got it. And at one point he says that Ian Smith is, committing political suicide. He's basically acted very honorably in all of this. Really? After the British and everyone was telling him, yeah, he'll go along to a certain point, but he'll wiggle off the hook. And I don't think Kissinger believed it. But Smith was a good wiggler, and he got off on that one as well. So towards the end of '76, and it's glaringly apparent that even though they've held this Geneva conference, nothing is going to come out of it. Kissinger is just sitting there waiting out the election and a new administration. And the final document in this compilation on Rhodesia is a meeting that he has with the Cyrus Vance and Andy Young coming in and talking about, okay, this is what you're facing going in. And he's still advocating that the U.S. not get directly involved in any of this. You can support the British, who are going to continue to do this, but we should not get involved. And yet, as you'll see in the Carter volume that will be coming out on this, we get deeply involved, very, very deeply involved in all of these areas. And largely it's a factor of the Carter administration. But also I think that they too began to understand that if we did not do something here, Carter and the rest of his administration also agreed that communists would take advantage of these vacuums and that we had to do something to thwart that. So,
fascinating. I'm sure you have lots of questions. I want to add just a couple of aspects. I mean, all of this resonates very true to life from my experience in many, many ways, and even the transition you're talking about. And from my point of view, having been on the desk for Portuguese African territories up to '75, and then we're dealing with Rhodesia from '76 onwards, caught that Kissinger visit before the change of administration came. But I saw it as actually a continuation of policy. Mm-hmm. Andy Young and Cyrus Vance basically picked up where Kissinger left off. Mm-hmm. What their considerations were, in their top-level meetings, and their rationale behind it, I'm not quite sure. But it was as if, well, it's been pushed this far. We've made these decisions, and I think we've got to pick up the ball and go. And so I remember many late-night meetings with Andy Young and Stony Cooks and et cetera around with the ambassador and the residents talking about this in Pretoria. One thread that, and I apologize for sake of full disclosure at not having read the documentation thoroughly. I've glanced over it, I just haven't had time to. But one thread that hasn't been picked up, and I do want to state, and it's somewhat defensive, but as you're talking about State Department policy, during this era. It's extremely important. I sort of joked a minute ago saying I went through quite a list of Assistant Secretaries of State during my short time as a desk officer for about 2.5 years. It's very important to know where the Africa Bureau was on this. When we're talking about State Department policy, we're talking about European Bureau, we're talking about policy planning, Hal Saunders, we're talking about Eagleberger, and we're talking about Kissinger, who drove this through his worldview. And I sat in many a meeting with a Don Easom or William Shoffley by my side. I was by their side, I better not put that wrong, but was brought into it as a relatively junior desk officer for 3 important countries, of course, actually more than that, because Sao Tome and Principe were in there as well, but it's Cape Verde and Angola and Mozambique. But it was there because we had no one else with sort of a depth of knowledge of any depth who could be up there. So I was often in these meetings, and the disdain with which the Assistant Secretary was treated, and actual verbal accusations that you don't understand how the world works, to very senior diplomats. And the record will show, I'm not sure if it's in this collection of volumes, but I've done some Freedom of Information Act searches on my own contributions, that we did at least 3 dissident channels on a National Security Council memorandum. The whole lead up to whether we would or wouldn't support UNITA, whether that would or wouldn't include further support for the FNLA and Holden Roberto's group out of Angola, out of Congo, and remembering that Holden Roberto was actually a paid informant for the CIA during all this time, not only a brother-in-law to our famous Mr. Mobutu. But we in the in the Africa Bureau and in the consulate at Angola, and in who were working in Africa, felt that we had absolutely there was no understanding in our hierarchy of and a disdain for African nationalism, African views, African feelings. It came out in many different ways, using a Kaunda and his sort of views on the Angola situation, where he had his own clientele there, was true. The use of Mobutu, who was, of course, willing to do anything for money, and et cetera, but never once thinking in terms of the long-term ramifications of all of this, because in the end, to them, Africa didn't matter. So we were making our disagreements known. We were getting fired right and left. You'll find cables in there from Tom Killeran, our very, very competent and senior consul general in Luanda during those days, whose career was basically ruined because of his disagreements with Kissinger over this. We were meeting with Neto inside when he came in. We were meeting with Savimbi. We had a clear idea of who these people were and who they weren't, what they really did mean, what the Soviet influence was. You refer to that, Anna Mart, and what it wasn't, and certainly up to January of 1976, it wasn't extensive. And we, in essence, kind of triggered their ratcheting up the game through our own stupidity. And on and on. So we really felt in the Africa Bureau sidelined by this whole thing, when, of course, it was playing out in our backyard. And those of us who survived it were kind of lucky. It's true what you've picked up in terms of the intelligence relationships. I do know, even when I went as a political officer down to Pretoria, looking into Rhodesia, but I talked to many people in intelligence service and in the military and et cetera, who felt there had been a strong commitment by the U.S. to support the invasion, South African invasion into Angola, and to thwart the Cubans. And certainly, although I don't know exactly what Kissinger and Ford ever said to Forster specifically, that was certainly an impression that was being left very purposely between our station chief in Pretoria and the highest levels of military intelligence in South Africa, that you don't have to worry, guys, we've got your back, kind of thing. So it's just an amazing period, and there's I could go on and on too about this, but we'll all stop there and open it up. We've only got about a half an hour to get some exchange here, and which is the Woodrow Wilson Center way. Let's hear your questions, your comments, your insights, because I think a lot of you around this table know a lot more than probably we do now.
I just want to thank Myra for doing this volume. It was an extraordinarily difficult task, a period when national liberation in Africa was coming to the fore. Cold War went into Africa. And this was, in fact, your first assignment. What was I thinking? But when I read the volume, all was well. And we made. I remember having long discussions with you. How do we fold in the Portuguese and the Azores, and how do we do this, and when do we start doing an Angola compilation? We made a lot of tough choices. We made a lot of decisions at having to sort of de-emphasize South Africa because we felt that the other issues were perhaps more important at the time. In the long run, of course, they probably weren't. But my congratulations to you, and it's always a real pleasure to see a volume come out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Myra,
Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what the domestic constituencies were in terms of American policies in Southern Africa. You've mentioned a few, but like who's watching what we're doing down there? Who cares about it?
Who cares about it? Quite a few people, actually. And really quite early on, a lot of churches are very concerned about what's going on in Southern Africa. They're writing their Congress people. They're trying to get students out of Southern Africa and bring them to the States to study and that kind of thing. But on a government level, it's the Congressional Black Caucus. This just jumps in there. And, of course, the subcommittees, foreign affairs subcommittees in Congress dealing with Africa are very, very concerned about what's going on. And they're keeping their feet to the fire. It's not terribly useful until they cut off the purse strings, and then it becomes very much so. But there's also corporations who are beginning to be very concerned. I cover briefly, this was the genesis for that whole State Department exercise for businesses in South Africa. I guess it's in 1970 that some Polaroid employees boycotted the company here because their products, they didn't do business per se, but the products they produced were used by the government in South Africa to produce the passbooks. And people were saying, you can't work for Polaroid. They were boycotting the man's house. And so they send a team down there to look at conditions, and they develop some strategies down there as well. So, it grows over time, but individual companies early on, some, I'm not sure if it was GM or one of the Detroit automakers that had facilities there was also getting involved.
Well, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors all had facilities, yeah.
So, it was a gradual thing, but kind of dispersed for a long time. You don't really see it come together in a concerted way until later.
Well, let me add to that because I absolutely agree with everything you just said, but there was a little more cause and effect here, I think, in my view, because I believe the disdain by the Nixon, Kissinger leadership towards black Americans, black leadership as a significant constituency caused some of the kind of motivation. You would see the growth of Trans-Africa, the coming into being of Trans-Africa as a lobby group on issues of this nature. The Black Caucus became organized around these issues. Charlie Diggs, of course, was legendary in many different ways in his position, but his chief of staff, Golder Butcher, was a huge influence in helping to start the American Committee on Africa and et cetera. The kind of civil society NGO world we live in today, where there are advocacy groups for everything, and they're out there by the dozens, and whatever you're dealing in, whether it's mineral exploitation in Congo or whatever it is, there's 27 of them you have to talk to. Didn't exist in. It was only coming into being, but as a desk officer for the Portuguese territories, I was beginning to meet with these, and they were almost all brand new and organizing around their frustration, a lot church-based, as you said, Mara. And so it did grow. So, and then the same thing, I remember when I went down to Pretoria, I didn't know this in advance, but we actually had developed a State Department Code of Conduct for American businesses down there, which was very much subsumed by the Sullivan Code later. And of course, when Sullivan came down, we helped to program him, meeting with everybody criticizes Sullivan and the Sullivan Code now an awful lot in retrospect, but actually what he heard from black leaders when he went down there as a board member of General Motors to investigate their position down there and what they should be doing on business practices and et cetera. What he heard basically was, what he reported and put in and fashioned his code around was what black leaders were telling him. There was not yet a strong disinvestment movement in the mid-'70s. There was a huge push for fair treatment, for fair wages, for pension plans, for management training, for all of these kinds of issues. And that's what he based it on. Now, that was going to begin to change dramatically after Soweto 76 and the despair that built around that, the state of emergency that came later, and blacks losing any faith in ever being able to find an outlet with the regime, to ever have their concerns taken into account by the regime. So, but all of this built up over time. But this is where we have that beginning of the growth of a constituency for these issues, and some of it comes out of the frustration that was engendered by that stonewall face of Kissinger and Nixon against all, feel-good, liberal kind of let's do the right thing people.
Yeah, Kissinger even remarked on that, as well as Nixon, saying we're not going to get their vote anyway, so we don't care what they think.
There you go.
So. I'd also like to address what you were saying about you all being put upon, because it does come out in the documents, Kissinger's total disdain for the Africa Bureau, and he just, I don't know what he was thinking, but at one point he says that the people in the Africa Bureau were more African than the Africans were. And, they called them missionaries. I mean, he just had nothing to do with them. And when Nat Davis basically told him, we should not be doing it, we should not be going full force into Angola, that was it. And he, gave him unshirted hell, as Kissinger used to say, and Davis was gone. And so the succession of people who actually knew what was going on and could give some good advice, it wasn't the advice he wanted to hear, so in typical Kissinger fashion, they were gone.
Yeah. No, I'm still very close to Don Esom, who lives in New York in his retirement, and he was, of course, brought in as Kissinger's fair-haired boy. I mean, he'd been a career African diplomat. David Newsom had been in that position for a very long time, was very senior, very well respected, but was on his way out. He wasn't fired by Kissinger. So Newsom was the guy who was going to be Kissinger's fellow. And Newsom wasn't in the job for a month and a half, and he was in deep clashes with Kissinger. And he's written his own memoir about this, which would be also very interesting for all of you to read in conjunction with this whole thing. But that succession through Davis and Shoffley and then poor Ed Mulcahy, who took over as acting and tried to hold the strands together. And, he's probably the true hero of all of this for just surviving it. And they were literally fired. It was a disdain, and I wasn't exaggerating. It was I sat in personal experience with Don Esom there and me here, with Kissinger just waving his finger in his face, saying, "You have no idea how the world works out there. You are just pro-African, and you don't understand the big picture." And
And nobody said, "And you don't understand Africa?"
Nobody had the guts to. I was too young. I would now.
In a lot of ways, it sounds like this is a volume about the frustration of the initial Nixon policy towards Africa. And I'm wondering, given that you've worked on Nixon, Ford, and Carter, who are very different people, obviously, how important you think U.S. presidents were towards shaping policy as opposed to just these intractable events and realities that they are battling against?
Well, unfortunately, the intractable events continue through the Carter administration. And while I would say that I think people went into that administration with very high hopes, they came out of it with a whole different perspective. And, you know, I like to call it the education of Jimmy Carter, because he thinks that, you know, by sheer force of will, I don't know, that he can really bring some sort of peace and tranquility to the region. And it just wasn't going to happen. The problems were very, very serious. And I think, I'm not quite sure if it would have made any difference if we had become more directly involved. Even though we are more engaged, it was still, you know, the British had to negotiate all of this. We were working directly with South Africa on Namibia, but the Carter administration's attitudes towards South Africa in particular were very different, whereas Kissinger was not willing to attack them. He figured, well, I need to work with these people, so I'm not going to say anything bad. Carter had no problem with doing that, and in fact, they did regularly. And basically, they just said, well, you know, Namibia is going to be a problem for you. Rhodesia is as well. So you should work with us because it's a problem for you, and while you're at it, clean up your own house. And the South Africans are looking at him like, what are you talking about? Kissinger never said anything. You know, and they actually try to continue to work with Kissinger. He has meetings with them, even though he's no longer in office. So I think in a way, the Carter administration, based on the fact that they were determined that South Africa was going to have to make some internal changes, may have exacerbated some of the situation, at least for as far as Namibia is concerned. Because South Africa wouldn't even refer to it as Namibia. They just kept calling it Southwest Africa, like Namibia was a phantom.
The South Africans also had an inflated vision of themselves in terms of their inroads to pockets of power, not just keeping in touch with Kissinger, but with certain conservative senators who were very supportive. They played off, of course, the domestic political situation here. From the inside, my own feeling was that I absolutely agree with your characterization from the president's point of view, that it was Nixon and Kissinger's NSC who formulated and drove the policy, the famous tar baby option, which is the one you're referring to. All apologies to Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox and everybody. That Ford then was driven by, he didn't put his stamp on it. He was driven by Kissinger, now as Secretary of State. And he basically went along with it. I don't remember a strong presidential, directive or oversight there from my not exalted position. And then Carter, exactly that, came in with some high hopes, but was in some ways trapped by the policy already underway, particularly as it concerned Rhodesia, and didn't make dramatic changes, and also agreed that South Africa was a partner in the Cold War and that you had to tread lightly there. Now, our relationships deteriorated, not just because of Soweto 76 and Walter Mondale saying one man, one vote in Geneva and things like this. The famous spy plane incident where they PNG'd poor Barry McConnell, who was the pilot of the plane, and these kinds of things. The South Africans were losing patience with us, but they thought they had other ways to go to keep U.S. support. By then, Angola was no longer the issue, and after the Byrd Amendment, after the Clark Amendment, and those changes there, and that was not the centerpiece anymore. But the South Africa Foundation working really dramatically hard here, urging support for the Sullivan Code and other things like this. They really had strong allies in the business community, particularly Exxon in New York and others, and significant black spokesmen like Mangosuthu Gachibuthelezi, were working the territory over here. And it was very hard for Americans, to sort that out. You have black spokespersons coming over saying, no sanctions, no disinvestment, we really need you there. I think things began to change in the 80s dramatically, partly because of Archbishop Desmond Tutu's presence here, and I say that very, very, very significantly. I mean, lots of pressure by the American Committee on Africa and by any number of other people, Trans-Africa, by liberals in Congress. But it wasn't until he was here at the New York Seminary for an extended period of time and appeared frequently in person and in radio and television newscasts and this and that there was suddenly a non-threatening face to the message of disinvestment. And his good humor and his presence really began to turn that in many ways, so that people began to rethink it. And that was what got Nancy Kassebaums and Dick Lugers and the Republicans and others, who were really the ones who were able to get the passage of the CAAA Act over Reagan's second veto in the end. For all the Ted Kennedys and Randall Robinson and others who pushed and pushed and pushed on that, and Howard Wolpe's and others, it was really that bipartisan coalition that finally made that happen. And so a lot of things were developing over time there. We're getting out of the subject matter, aren't we?
Can I just make a comment coming back to that transition from Nixon to Carter? In a sense, it just exacerbated the situation in South Africa itself tremendously. Carter being duped as the human rights president in South Africa, and Puk Botha sitting with his head in his hands when they heard that Carter was elected. Oh my goodness, they're not going to work with us anymore. So what happened in South Africa is it let the South African apartheid regime turn inside. Whereas prior to that, they had hopes of still working with the United States, in getting a solution in Southern Africa, and in the same vein, still kind of hold on to their position of power in the region. With Carter, all that disappeared. So within 11 months after Carter was elected, they slapped us with a mandatory arms embargo. That was the one thing. 1978, South Africa launched what was called the Total Strategy, to say if there's any attack going to come to South Africa, we cannot bargain on the West to come and help us out. We need to do this ourselves. It led to a decision to develop nuclear weapons in 1978, all because of that transition, not all because, but the major reason was that transition from the Nixon administration to the Carter administration. Of course, when Reagan was elected, he was more favorable again towards South Africa, but at that point, some of the damage had already been done. South Africa by 1977, 1978, actually before Carter was elected, South Africa was more than willing to give independence to Namibia by 1979. It was on the table. The agreement was ready to be signed. As soon as Carter was elected, it was off the table. And you all know what happened during the 1980s in the Southern African region, Namibia, Angola. It would be another 10 years before Namibia, eventually through the diplomacy of Chester Crocker, mainly, would gain their independence from South Africa.
Yeah, that's true. Don McHenry leading the Five, as they called them,
right.
in '76 was very close to an agreement. I was also backstopping that negotiation, and all of that fell apart. Don is forever angry at Chet, though, because when Chet came in, he didn't ask Don how he'd gotten to that point where he was at, and still hasn't asked him today.
Myra, when I was doing the global issues volumes for 73 to 76, my question is sort of a group of 77 question, essentially, and how important all that was, because the U.S. is feeling increasingly outvoted at the UN, and there's a move from this, sort of emerging group of post-colonial states to sanction allies, and so they try to kick the Portuguese out of the UN. They try and kick the South Africans out of the UN, and they actually are successful in removing South Africa from the International Civil Aviation Organization, which struck me as a pretty counterproductive move if you want to have air safety in Southern Africa. But nevertheless, so but my question for you, that was a relatively prominent element of one or two chapters in the global issues volumes that I did, but I'm curious whether this mattered at all to the South Africans. Were they all that worried about this? Does this show up at all in your volume?
No.
To their relative position at the UN as being increasingly weak, and does that matter that much to them?
Their concerns that that are brought out here are based on what the U.S. is going to do at the UN. That's their only real concern. I think, actually, I think Andy Young was the one originally telling the Carter administration that if you keep pushing the South Africans, they're going to go into lager. I mean, there's this, what they call the lager mentality.
Exactly what we did.
Yeah, of South Africa. Well, exactly. And so, you know, I think the U.S. going into the Carter prior to the Carter administration was very reluctant to take any real action against South Africa in the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And so I don't think they really cared what all else was going on with these, because they knew these African states were trying very hard to sanction them on any number of issues, but their greatest concern was what we were doing.
Maya, I was just curious if this volume shows anything with regard to the Israeli relationship that develops with South Africa at this time. Did that come through in the documents, especially on the sensitivity of certain issues? That there was a newspaper article that actually showed South Africa itself had declassified a document in 1975 that Shimon Peres had gone to South Africa and offered to sell nuclear weapons. But I'm just curious if the Nixon administration's observing these things, curious about these things, or worried about these things.
It becomes a big deal for Carter. I'll just put it like that. But no, not so much in this.
Yes, please.
Can I comment? I've written an opinion piece on that Guardian article that I can forward to you. In fact, Sasha Polakov-Suransky, in his book on the Israeli-South African relations, do mention the agreement between South Africa and Israel in 1975. And of course, Israel, an ally of the United States, it must have caused some concern in the Nixon administration at the time, if they even knew about that. But be it as it may, I actually, there were only 2 documents in the entire Israeli-South African nuclear file that were accidentally declassified. The rest of those documents, we've been looking for those documents for years now. So the Guardian article, the journalist there made some deductions from the book of Sasha Polakov-Suransky that was incorrect. Polakov-Suransky in the end also admitted to the fact that he said, but you know, you did not make the correct deduction here. Avner Cohen, who's also the expert on the Israeli nuclear program, he also commented on that. So if you're interested, I can forward you the piece.
I might just
clear the record on that. Yeah.
Yeah. I might just say in general, though, that obviously Israel and U.S. relationship with Israel is a backdrop to all of this. I mean, the Azores bases, of course, because of resupply of Israel in '73 and the projected need for that in the future, although technology went way beyond that eventually. And then the other side of it is the close relationship of Israel and South Africa through those years. I mean, Israel was supplying fighter jets, was supplying.
Exactly.
I mean, they built before you started building your own the riot vehicles that you went into townships with police and all these kinds of things. So they were a big presence and a big importance there. Now, how that impacted on our policy and the policy development, particularly under Carter, I don't know. I mean, I don't think, because there was sort of the Israeli relationship, and there was kind of the liberal Jewish Democratic Party lobby types who became favorites of the Carter administration, and so there's a lot of nuances around it that I wouldn't know how to sort out.
There was a definite triangle between South Africa, Israel, and the United States. South Africa being under a mandatory arms embargo after 1977 cost us dearly. We paid very dearly for the military equipment that was needed at the time, that the apartheid government needed, to maintain the war in Angola and to suppress the black population in South Africa that was busy rising up. But it was only really toward the end of the 1980s that you find that the United States started to publicly lash out at Israel because of the collaboration with South Africa. I couldn't find anything, even in the US documents or the South African documents up until this point, that show very determined actions by Nixon or Carter or Reagan against the Israelis, okay, for some sort of collaboration with South Africa. In the 1980s, South Africa had built a fighter jet that was called the Cheetah, and that was on the blueprints of the Israeli Kafir, which flew with a jet engine supplied by the United States. So yeah, I became interested in the military field because I had an uncle in the Air Force who was actually the liaison between Israel and South Africa in buying those jet engines for South Africa's Cheetah. So, but it was only really by 1988 that the United States, for the first time, spoke out publicly against Israel for their collaboration with South Africa. Of course, Israel was instrumental in violating the arms embargo against South Africa. We worked with them for the Jericho 2 missile that we bought from them. That missile was capable of being fitted with a tactical nuclear warhead. South Africa only really at the end of the 1980s was at the point where we were busy with developing blueprints, with the research into tactical nuclear warheads. So 1975, 76, no, Israel didn't give us tactical nuclear warheads. So.
Yeah, but by the end of the 80s, though, the whole atmosphere had changed with the passage of the CAAA by then.
Yes, exactly, 1986.
Reagan about on his way out and things beginning to change.
Yes.
Of course, you had the Canadians supplying those great 8-inch howitzers that were so accurate.
Yes, the Space Research Corporation, the South African, the 155 millimeter cannon that we built was built on the blueprints that we obtained clandestinely from the Canadian firm, the Space Research Corporation. So we just took it a step further, and those shells could also be fitted with tactical nuclear warheads.
Wow.
Lots were going on. South Africans were good.
A real intensification of U.S. interest in the region as a whole during this period. Were South Africans happy that Kissinger was on the case, or kind of freaked out that Kissinger was focusing his abilities on the region?
Well, I would have to rely here on things that I heard people speak about. As I was really very small at that stage. But looking at the overall, it was really a small group of securocrats in Pretoria that were really worried about what happened in Southern Africa and whether South Africa would keep the apartheid policy going and whether we could still be in charge of Southwest Africa. For the normal man on the street, I don't think they really cared. For them it was just, oh yeah, they were in a privileged position. They were definitely in a privileged position. I grew up in a privileged position. Because of that, and only really realized when I went to university what was going on here, coming from the countryside into a liberal environment, and for the first time realizing, oh my goodness, okay, what are we doing? That was at the beginning of the 1990s. But way back in the 70s, I think it didn't really matter. It mattered after 76 because we had conscription, of our, if the boys left school, they had to go to the army for 2 years. So many families started to worry about that. That was the closest they have actually come to what was happening, in the region, was the fact that they had to send their sons to the border. But as to the bigger policy of what was happening, I don't think they really cared.
I can add a little bit to that answer, again, from my perspective, because I think there was a little bit of a love-hate relationship of South Africans and Kissinger. When Kissinger rolled in down there with his bluster and his, and his persona and his entourage and his world wiseness, he kind of overwhelmed everybody, including Forster. And I don't think Forster really appreciated it to begin with, but he
wasn't a man that was easily
not
overshadowed.
easily, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Dick Clark could never do it. Nobody else I ever saw meeting with him personally could do it. But but on the other hand, he had full faith in Kissinger's dedication down to communism. To the big picture that Kissinger was painting, and so he allowed himself to be pushed. I don't think he wanted to lay that mandate down to Ian Smith in the way Kissinger insisted that it be done. But Kissinger basically told Smith the game is up, and now we just got to manage how you're going to get out of here. And do it in as fair and equitable a manner as possible, protecting white minority rights in Rhodesia while we do it. And everybody caved to Kissinger and said, "Okay, let's work out the details," kind of thing. So I think there was, it was the bully on the block kind of thing, but we actually trust him because we think he's taken us in the right direction. Didn't disagree with the principle of we're all down here fighting communism.
And it was also not really anti-South African, I think, which was the view of the South Africans. Hey, but Kissinger is working with us. He's not trying to kind of like, push us into the ground. He's actually working with us. So there wasn't an overall negative attitude towards him. Maybe towards his persona, yes, but not. He was favorable towards South Africa in many aspects.
I think power likes power.
Yeah,
one autocrat really gets along well with another autocrat.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
With all due respect, Mr. Kissinger. We've got about 5-6 more minutes if we want. The reason to wait for the microphone is because we are being webcast, so your voice doesn't get picked up if you don't wait for the microphone. Right now.
Mario, you said a little bit about some of the congressional committees, church organizations, NGOs, this sort of thing here, who tried to influence our policy there. But did you pick up much about how active the embassy and consulates in South Africa were at making contact with the anti-apartheid movement and finding out what was going on there?
Oh, absolutely. I did not have enough space to print all of that sort of thing, but yeah, well, but yes, and very active in monitoring the way trials were going, especially after the bannings and all. The embassy was very, very involved.
That was me.
In that. Oh, that was you. Okay.
Well, it's very interesting. You mentioned, even while I was still on the desk for Portuguese territories, as the policy began to evolve that you mentioned earlier in your remarks, at first we had no contact with liberation movements. Then it was decided we did need to have contact with them, but it would be a very low level, desk officer level. It wouldn't be assistant secretary, it wouldn't be a deputy assistant secretary. And so I can remember many a meeting with Shafruddin Khan, the Frelimo representative at some hotel downtown here, it's working the territory. When I got to South Africa, we had a very simple embassy in those days. We had a political officer covering white affairs, political officer covering black affairs. I was a black affairs political officer. And so I was the one who sought out Steve Biko and Desmond Tutu. And actually, I got great stories to tell because I didn't seek out Desmond Tutu. He's a friend of mine to this day. But I was actually going to seek out Leah Tutu, who was the head of the Domestic Workers Union and a very powerful labor leader. And he happened to be sitting in the living room and was a nice guy. But anyway, so we were. But it was under the radar. I was doing my reporting. I was feeding in all of the contact work we were doing. But I'll give you an example to explain what I mean by under the radar. I developed a friendship that I still have to this day with the Biko family. Nobadili Bandi Biko, the sister, is a good friend of mine, and the remaining family members, mothers passed away, brothers passed away, many are gone now. But I developed that friendship. At the time of his death, I was invited by the family to come down for the funeral. And so I went into the Ambassador Bowdler at the time, and I said, Ambassador Bowdler, I'm invited to go down to the Biko funeral. And he said, well, no, we won't have a presence there. And I said, well, then I'm going to take leave and go down as a private person because I'm a friend of the family. He said, you can do what you want to do. So that was the circumstances under which I went. It was very interesting that I got a phone call. I went down about 5 days before the funeral, was visiting with friends and family and et cetera. I got a phone call the day before the funeral from the ambassador saying, Steve, we've just learned that some of the Scandinavian ambassadors are now going down officially to attend the funeral, and we've made a decision that we will be represented there now. So I'm going to come down. Can you set up an appointment with me with the family and a viewing of the body and et cetera to do that? So that was kind of the way it operated. You always were tiptoeing around, not making it too apparent, making sure it was a junior officer who was doing all the work. When Charlie Diggs came into town, I could trot out a bunch of students for him to meet and things like that, so we could put on the show we needed for our visitors. But we kept that very, very low level through about 79 or 80. Lasted late in the game.
I have a question as to whether you think Kissinger was just wrong. Whether you think Kissinger was just wrong about the MPLA and Angola, or whether he was thinking that we need to take a loss here for reasons having to do with our relationship with the Soviet Union, and in some ways I might compare it to the 1971 war in South Asia, where the U.S. pursued a policy that was really disastrous towards Bangladesh, but that he felt, at least he would try and defend himself by saying that in terms of our relationship with China and the Soviet Union, it was a loss that we needed to take. Do you think there's a defense at all for, in terms of geopolitics, that he believed at least?
I personally think Kissinger was just wrong about the MPLA.
I agree.
And that was part of the falling out between the Africa Bureau and him. And those around him, particularly policy planning and Hal Saunders. We were talking to Neto, and Neto was doing everything he could to convince us that he was going to be a good Democrat and not to worry. You know, he was a poet. He was a different kind of liberation fighter than he was pictured to be. The Soviet influence was minimal at that time. It grew very, very strong later, and it grew strong only after we made a strong commitment to FNLA and UNITA. And so I really think he was just wrong about it, and that was I mean, Tom Tilleran, our Consul General, continued to have meetings with Neto over those first days after after the Alvar Agreement, and they all came to town. I went down a couple of times as desk officer and was in on some of those meetings, including with Savimbi, and to us, Savimbi was the worst of them all. We saw Savimbi as a real player, as a guy you couldn't trust at all. That's the Africa Bureau position on him. We saw Roberto as sort of the handyman of Mobutu's and maybe a necessary evil. But Neto we saw as really a good potential. It was kind of like Frelimo while Eduardo Montalban was still alive and before his death on the other side of the continent. So I think he was just wrong. That's my opinion, though.
Well, I would agree, certainly, because I think it speaks to Kissinger not understanding Africa. I don't think any black African country wanted the Soviets in any more than they wanted the former colonial powers in. They wanted everybody out. And, Kissinger was told that multiple times by various African leaders, and it seemed to go in one ear and out the other if it even registered at all. But it didn't fit into his worldview, so he never...
Yeah, no, I think the South Africans just played into his hand.
Yes.
By invading Angola.
Okay, we're over time. We're going to have to call it quits. Doesn't mean you have to leave the room or stop talking, but I'm going to have to go. Thank you very much.